All right. Welcome to the Higher Education TIG Chat. The title is The Need is Now Adopting Evaluation in Higher Education to Combat the Current Political Context of Assessment. We're excited to have our presenter today, Dr. Divya Bheda. She is the Director of Educational Assessment at Santa Clara University, where she oversees academic and co-curricular continuous quality improvement efforts that center student success and social justice. She has a PhD in Critical and Social Cultural Studies and Education from the University of Oregon, and she has over 15 years of experience in the field in online and brick and mortar contexts, the ed tech industry, and the nonprofit world. She teaches, writes, consults, and coaches interinstitutional teams and colleagues in equity-oriented continuous improvement, strategic planning, assessment, and evaluation and educational development best practices. She's also the principal consultant at DB Consulting Services, capacity building for change and equity. I'm going to hand it over to our presenter now, and she can share her slides and the presentation.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you all for being here today and spending your valuable time for this conversation. And I want to make sure that you know it is a conversation. I'm hoping to bounce off some ideas that have been percolating in my head for a few years now and kind of get your response to it and inform and have an informed discussion and conversation about my perspectives. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I also am going to be using Poll Everywhere as a interactive tool for us to engage. So I'm going to share the link, or Kevin's going to help, or Nidhi's going to help put the link in the chat for you to access so that you can respond on Poll Everywhere. So let's start with, where we are. How are people feeling? Where are you at, given your specific context and given the state of higher education today? And I would say there are days where I'm in the red, there are days where I'm in the green. I feel very blessed to be in California, very privileged to be at a Jesuit institution, having not affiliated myself with religion per se, but with the values that we are able to still talk about issues that are very, very intrinsic to the Catholic Jesuit faith. So this is also just a check-in. As much as we engage with intellectually on various things, there are emotions tied to it. And so just want to welcome all of you in your whole selves to the conversation as you get familiar with Poll Everywhere. So you can see I'm just going to give it another minute or two, or no, 10 seconds. I see someone managed a tick mark. I want to know how you did that. If you want to put it in the chat. Yeah, so none of us are feeling too excited. All of us are in the zone, and that's the reality today. We're dealing with a lot of pressures, and we'll get into more details of that as we have this conversation. But a second question that I want to ask all of you here, just to get a sense of who is in the room, as I'm not able to follow the chat as quickly as you all are typing in as I present. How many of you all identify as being an assessment accreditation professional versus like your primary role is that of a faculty member versus primary role is staff, administrator, leader, independent consultant? Yeah. Okay, so heavily assessment accreditation professional. That's wonderful. Okay, thank you. And then we have administrators and leaders here as well. Okay, this is great. Just going to give it another 10 seconds just in case someone didn't get on Poll Everywhere. Yes, Matt was like, what's the emoji for Matt? Yes. Okay, so thank you. So we all have a sense of who is in the room, kind of in terms of our titles and roles. So again, thank you for your time and for being here. I'm going to move to the next slide, and once I move slides, you won't be able to respond on the Poll Everywhere question. Okay. I know Kevin did such a wonderful job of introducing me, and I'm going to just build off of that. There's a reason why I always do this, because I want to orient you to what I'm saying and where I come from. And so I'd like you to know a little bit about me. I came here as an international student, and that kind of my lived experience of being in a primarily white institution and in that kind of a program also led me to a commitment and to action and activism around student success, heavily about student success. What is the lived experience of the students, not just what is graduation rate, what is completion rate, what is the time to graduation, what is postgraduate outcome in terms of jobs, but also what is the lived experience of the student while in their learning journey, not just academic, but their lived experience, right? So there's that like my lived experience has generated a huge commitment to student success. I was also blessed to be in a PhD program that was about social-cultural, like critical and social-cultural studies in education. And so that was, I got exposed to Black, Indigenous, decolonizing, women of color, feminist scholars, and their scholarship and their work inculcated a lot of knowledge in me and worldviews and epistemological orientations around social justice that have served me really well in the work that I do, because I'm able to infuse it. I don't have to talk about it, just infuse it in the work that I do. I studied and trained in program evaluation. I did a lot of work around program evaluation during my doctoral degree. But then I grew in the field of assessment and accreditation. So that's where I pivoted. And so I feel like when Kevin reached out to me to do this talk, I feel like I'm feeling reconnected again with the higher ed TIG and with AEA. So it's been wonderful. And I get to straddle both worlds, sometimes more heavily in the AEA TIG. There was a lot of work that we did as part of the feminist TIG and some decolonizing work that we did over the last few years, and then now this, but also in the assessment world. I felt very connected when I trained, and I still feel very connected to empowerment evaluation and feminist evaluation as approaches. And when we think about it from the evaluation tree, it's the idea of use and values, like how are we using assessment, how are we using evaluation, and then what is the value that's driving the work that we do. So that's very important to me. And I've worked across, as Kevin mentioned, I worked across multiple sectors and types of higher ed spaces. So there's a breadth and depth there in all kinds of spaces in higher ed, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but I've done curriculum design work, consulting work, co-curricular, student affairs assessment, as well as academic assessment, institutional assessment, accreditation. So you will see all of this playing out in why my thought leadership is the way it is and why I'm offering some ideas for you to ponder. Okay, so when you think about one word to describe your assessment culture at your institution, what is that word? And if it's more than one word, if it's a phrase, if you could hyphenate it or make sure that it doesn't have any space, because otherwise Poll Everywhere takes it as separate words. Mm-hmm. My eyes are drawn to transient because this is the first time I've heard that particular word used, and I'm very, very intrigued. And it went away. Please leave it in there. Whoever typed it in, you can type in more. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So a lot of folks are talking about that it's complicated, it's messy, it's evolving, emerging, it's kind of haphazard, disorganized, not where you'd like it to be. Aspirational is that continuous improvement and change. So thank you for sharing your feedback. One second, I just realized I'm eating into the other screen. Okay. Just give you a moment if you want to do a screen grab, but this is kind of reflective pretty much every time I do a conversation or a talk. It reflects the breadth of people's experiences with their assessments on their campuses. Yeah. I'd also like to ask you if you can. So I thought I put in a different picture, but it's I guess the x-axis and y-axis have not been elaborated. So if you look at the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, think about compliance as being closer to the left, and then when you hit the arrowhead, you are working towards continuous improvement, right? The same thing on the vertical axis, the y-axis, compliance is lower down and improvement is higher up. So when you think about that culture, the word that you use to describe your culture, now I'd like you to think about the effort that you're putting in. Right? You are putting in, as well as those you serve or those you partner with at your institution, the effort that they put in. So where does it fall for you? Is it that where you are trying to be improvement oriented, but they are compliance oriented? Is it that you both are compliance oriented? You feel a lot of your time is sucked up in compliance? So if you could just indicate where you kind of are at your institution in terms of the work that you're doing. And for anyone who's outside a box, I ask you to look at the box and see if you can put yourselves in the box where the pin is in the box. Okay, so it's good that nobody is in full compliance mode. Nobody feels like, me in terms of my work as an assessment professional or in whatever role that I'm engaging with assessment, and those who I work with or collaborate with, none of us. So the fact that none of us are in compliance mode is really exciting, right? And then you are in improvement mode. So it looks like a majority of us are here where we're struggling with this idea that and I'm speaking as an assessment professional. I'm the director for educational assessment at Santa Clara University in the Bay Area in California, and I oversee both co-curricular and curricular assessment. And so it's interesting to see that a lot of us are here because we want to work towards improvement. We want to kind of encourage and build that. But many times the people that we serve don't necessarily perceive it that way, and then their efforts are very compliance oriented, right? It's also nice to see a lot of folks here in the improvement, like where both of you are improvement and continuous improvement oriented. So I'd love to hear from you when we open it up for conversation. And then there are a few who are like, oh yes, I see myself more as trying to check the boxes and make sure we are adhering to standards versus my partners want more of the improvement, support. So there's literally one person, it seems like, over here. So again, just to get a sense of the room. So this is where my thinking is. I'm being vulnerable with you, and I'm offering some thinking for you to comment on and think through and kind of cogitate and have reactions to. It's not necessarily right. I literally have 2 slides and all the ideas are laid out over there, right? The parallels that I see between assessment and evaluation is that both are evidence-based. We look for data, we look for different kinds of evidence, we're pulling that together to inform decision-making, right? So there's parallels there. We see that both of them are for improvement, action, decision-making. Again, obvious. Both often evoke negative feelings, and if anyone's going to challenge me on this, I dare you to. But both oftentimes evoke negative feelings. When we say you have to do assessment, it's like, oh my God, or I'm going to get evaluated, oh my God, right? So there is that. Co-curricular, and so where I see overlap and parallels is for any of you who engage in co-curricular assessment, like student services, administrative offices, that kind of assessment. There's such an easy map on to program evaluation in terms of the work that we do, because in terms of whether it's the accreditation standards that ask it, or whether it's in terms of just continuous improvement work where the division wants you to do something differently. Folks are working towards continuous improvement, so they're building on that. What is working well? What is not working well? Right? But the issue that comes up oftentimes in co-curricular assessment that program evaluation can help, and I'll talk about that a little. I'll table that for a little for the next slide. Program review for me is heavily needs assessment, and so again, feel free to think through that. But for me, program review, whenever we think about program review, whether it's on the co-curricular side of the house, whether it's accreditation, program review on the academic side of the house, that is basically where you're engaging in a needs assessment to see what is needed in the present day, what is the context like today, what do you already have that you can offer that you're doing really well, what do you need to sunset, what do you need to grow. So it's kind of like this figuring out the mismatch between the opportunities and the needs, figuring out the gaps and addressing that. So for me, when we say program review, I'm often like, okay, so basically we're doing a needs assessment, right? And then if y'all haven't used logic models from program evaluation, please look at logic models. Again, they are an easy way to get your partners at your institution looking at assessment and thinking about assessment in a meaningful way, where you say, this is what you want to achieve, this is what you're doing towards achieving it, these are the resources you're using, This is how you'll know whether you've been successful or not. This is going to be the findings. This is what your metric for success is, and here are what are your findings and next steps, right? So the logic model, the program evaluation foundational logic model, has served me really well in getting people to start thinking in a particular logical way in which they do assessment and they think about continuous improvement. So please look for that as a resource. And then I have a problem with the way this is articulated, but Alnoor Ibrahim has talked about this in the nonprofit sector. He talks about 3 types of accountability stakeholders. He talks about upwards accountability stakeholders, horizontal accountability stakeholders, and downwards accountability stakeholders. And what he says is that, so basically upwards accountability stakeholders are accreditors, the board, funders, right? All of those, like people who hold power and money. Horizontal accountability stakeholders are your peers who work with you, so likely your institutional partners, people you collaborate with. And then downwards accountability stakeholders, again, I'm not for the upwards downwards, but it's a useful framework. And downwards accountability stakeholders are the people that you serve, right, which is your students. So when we think about the parallels between assessment and evaluation, unfortunately, it's often, assessment and evaluation is often requested or required by upwards accountability stakeholders, right? It is meant to serve, like that accountability is in place to ensure that we are doing what we say we're doing, or the program is doing what it says it's supposed to do for the downwards accountability stakeholders. But a lot of times it is required or asked of by upwards accountability stakeholders, which then by the very nature of that request or that ask then puts a power differential between who has a voice, who has a seat at the table, who gets to influence your assignment, assessment design, who gets to be on that curriculum mapping exercise, right? So there immediately is a power differential, immediately in terms of data reporting, who has access to the data that you share out. And which is where, for me, then that feminist evaluation orientation, the empowerment evaluation orientation comes to mind, and I can keep using that as a framework to say, this is our orientation, this is our framework for how we do it, and so we need to make sure that this dissemination goes out to all our students. They were the ones who took the survey, they need to hear about it. Or these are the folks who are going to be impacted by this decision making from the climate survey, so they need to be at the table to help interpret the data, because their office is the one that deals with a lot of this stuff, right? So trying to figure out, making sure that the horizontal accountability stakeholders and your downwards accountability stakeholders are at the table. And this speaks to kind of the literature for those of you who are not on the assess listserv or not in assessment spaces apart from AEA, for you to think about where equity and assessment, we keep talking about where is the student voice, where are we looking at all of that in the work that we're doing. So those are the paddles. I'm going to come back to you all for questions once we stop recording, because after the presentation, we'll stop the recording and open it out. So what do you see? So in terms of what I have shared so far, what do you see are the intersections between assessment and evaluation? Feel free to, add your comments here. This is free response and it's de-identified. So this is a good way for those who are watching the recording in the future to capture your valuable ideas. Even if you put it in the chat, this is great. So I'll give you a minute or so. Methods, yes. How do we get that evidence, right? That the methods that we use, the ontological foundations are there. Yes, similar pressures for practitioners, absolutely. Mode of inquiry. I'd like to know more. I'm not sure I understand. So whoever's typed up that, if you want to expand on that in another comment, you can put in more comments. Yes. So when we define assessment as assessment being formative, unfortunately, I kind of skipped over that. I was hoping nobody would notice, but assessment in higher ed is often kind of considered evaluation, like how we think of evaluation is it's kind of used interchangeably in higher ed depending on where you are, what context you are. So yes, there is a judgment versus over here it is for continuous improvement and learning. Absolutely. Clarifying and defining outcomes, similar data, yes. I want to know who said this, iced tea versus sweet tea. Again, please feel free to clarify here or in the chat. Storytelling, absolutely. Both require some element of storytelling. Both are tools for improvement. Both should center students in the higher ed context, absolutely. Yes. Okay. So with that, now I want to offer up really quickly the almost last slide that I have around what I see as opportunities or considerations that I haven't seen many of my colleagues use yet. So again, this is feedback. I'm looking for your ideas, your thoughts as I offer this to you. So in assessment, the big, the work that was done in assessment and how it came to being is that it's faculty owned, right? Assessment should be faculty owned. It's everyone should be able to do it. And so in all our institutions, we have faculty and staff who come into it. So that's why that transient word in the word cloud really stuck with me, because yes, for many folks, they're coming into this as a program chair, as a program director, and then they finish that term, they learn about it as much as they need to, and then they move on. Hopefully the learnings have stuck and it applies to the work that they do in the future, but maybe not, right? So the idea that all faculty should own assessment, that assessment should be owned by faculty, I feel like I want to challenge that. And this is where I feel like there is a body of work, and there is a body of work in assessment. There is a body of work like long before assessment in program evaluation, that I feel like the expertise of these fields needs to also be recognized, right? That if we say assessment can be done by anyone, I no longer believe like that's true. It's kind of saying everyone can teach. No, you have to be trained. Everyone knows their subject matter. They may be experts in their field that they have been trained in. But in terms of curriculum design, not everybody can design curricula really well. Not everyone can design assignments really well. Not everyone can, have good, strong pedagogical approaches, right? So it's a learning process. And so while while the intention, yes, is to build on that academic freedom and to build on the faculty collective shared governance model, I also believe that it needs to be led by expertise and facilitated with people who have expertise in program evaluation and assessment. And I often feel that we underplay that, and that leads to the next problem, which again, this could be again in my experience and in talking to colleagues, in all of the years that I have done this work, what the biggest challenge that I've found, because I've done program evaluation as well as an independent consultant, what I've often found is that, and I think I just managed to read one word or one phrase about independent, peer reviewers and evaluators who come in. This idea that when we are assessment offices on our campuses, that all that we do is present our findings, that we don't feel that we have the authority to make a recommendation, right? Most of the times in assessment, we say, these are the findings, and this is what we found, and then please go do what you will with this information. And we don't necessarily strongly advocate for a certain course of action. Versus when you come in as an external evaluator or a peer reviewer, or when you do program evaluation, you make recommendations. And one would think that if your services have been sought, like those recommendations are going to be taken seriously, right? So I feel like if we were to bring in more of our program evaluation approach or orientation, I feel that we should be making recommendations. And yes, we have to make sure that we figure out our own biases. We know the politics of the institution, all of that. But where is only presentation of findings, which then leads to that problem where we know the reality that there is this issue on our campus, and we know it, and we know it, and we keep assessing it to death, right? And students, every year we ask students, can you please tell us how you feel about this issue, or what are your needs? And then there's no action taken on XYZ. And then next year it's oh, we need more data. That data is 3 years old, so we need to collect that data again. And that's what makes students or even our colleagues or whoever's taking surveys, really kind of ambivalent about taking surveys or giving feedback, because it's no actions being taken. So I wish we would move more towards program evaluation, where we could make recommendations and say, This is what the data says. This is what we found. Yes, everyone can collectively engage in meaning making. Again, an opportunity for multiple ways in which we can use different evaluation frameworks to make sure that all community members are represented in making meaning of the data, but then to make recommendations based off of that, like very intentionally, right? And that can lead to intentional, important equity conversations and considerations by having all those people make sense of that data and take it forward. And again, the theory behind the practice, like I said, I was raised in evaluation. I moved over to assessment, so it was learning on the job, and then grew in the job. But I feel like there's a huge body of work in terms of the theory behind the practice that both of these fields have, and for me, evaluation more so than assessment. That there are all these ways in which you look at data and you look at information, and all these approaches that I feel like we can gain in our assessment work, where we can say, here's why. I give you an example. We are doing a project for a particular discipline to see why certain students, and this is by their identity and demographic factors, are not doing so well in this particular discipline. And so the question was, when we approach this particular project where we're trying to experiment with different types of classes and interventions for student success, whether we want to do it by way of an experimental design where it tells us by doing this led to the students performing better in this course, right? And we intentionally chose not to do it that way because we want all students to be successful. And I could offer an evaluation framework that affirmed that, rather than an experimental design or an assessment design that could say that you should do it only where you're able to directly establish causation or high correlation, significance testing. So you're able to offer these different approaches to the same issue where you can justify a pathway forward that can support equity, that can support all students' success, right? So which speaks to then you can live and enact your values of student success for all. We don't have to talk about it anymore. We can just infuse it into the work because we adopt a framework or a way of engaging it. I remember how excited I was and continue to be by all my learning from the field of program evaluation and from the practitioners in program evaluation, whether it's like the CRE, the Culturally Responsive Evaluation Group, Feminist Evaluation Group, Multi-Ethnic, the TIG, right? So there's like all of these scholars who are doing this work and offering us frameworks to orient ourselves to do this methodological work. Outside of that value-aligned approaches, the methodology can then just reside in positivism, and that can lead us to significant inequities in the work that we're doing. Okay. The other thing, and I'm kind of working on a book for this, and I've spoken about this in other sessions, is this idea that we can change the focus. When we adopt a program evaluation, we're no longer only about assessing student success or student outcomes, right? We can switch the focus to looking, if we want to assess student learning and student performance. I wish I had a poll about this. Damn it! Sorry, I shouldn't. Now it's coming, but okay. Let me frame my thought and share it with you. So there's research to show that when we look at student artifacts, so let's say there's an outcome that we are assessing. When we look at student artifacts, we build the rubric, we calibrate, we bring all the faculty together, we assess, how the students are doing. A lot of times, the finding basically has been, and this has been written about across assessment literature, right? That it's often the assignment design and the assignment prompts that are not tied to the outcome. So that's foundational. So we are not able to make inferences about student learning because all of this foundational work to make sure we're able to assess that artifact is not even done. So if we flip the script and say our assessment job, our evaluation job is actually to go look at the curricula. Our job is to actually do a meta-analysis of pedagogy. So rather than having the focus constantly on students and student artifacts, because oftentimes that's not giving us the information that we need. And that's where I wish I had the poll to say, like, how many of you have found in your, reports from your partners or from your academic programs, and maybe you can put it in the chat. You can say a yes or a no. How many of you have found that that has actually resulted in meaningful change, and I'm very important, like meaningful change and improvement, that the student learning outcomes assessment, just that endeavor, resulted in meaningful continuous improvement and change. Yay or nay? And I have found more often than not that it hasn't, that the assessment is a compliance exercise that my partners engage in. Sometimes they find meaning, but rarely do they, because it becomes a rote exercise where it's just like, okay, we take this number of these artifacts, we do it, and that the effort that goes into calibration and rubric development and all of that, I feel can be channeled differently to say, let's all get to a certain level of excellence in terms of our curriculum. Let's all get to a certain level of excellence in terms of our resources, in terms of our pedagogy, right? And so how do we kind of infuse this is by getting at it, going meta, like so saying, yes, we're doing outcomes assessment, but we are approaching it from a program evaluation lens to see what needs to improve about the program, which means I'm doing a syllabus review, which means I'm looking at pedagogy, which means I'm looking at, faculty teaching, I don't know, all the elements of that contribute to student success. Okay. And then my recommendation or suggestion to you is that you would ideally want to live, you have to figure out where you live, because these are multiple fields. You have to learn the discipline. So in program evaluation, whoever you're serving, whichever partner you're working with, you have to understand their expertise and learn from that. But then you also have to develop as a skill, as a professional, where do you live? Do you live in data? Is that where your skill set is? Do you live in assessment in terms of thinking through that design and designing something really well, and then someone can take over and do the methods and analysis? Are you in educational development where it's about curriculum design? So you need to figure out like where do you live so that you're on top of the best practices of that field. And so making sure that you do that is really important. That's what will be required. And then this last thing about collaborator versus enforcer goes back to literally the second point that I made, which is you need to figure out how to walk that. It's not an easy line, and we'll need to figure out how to be adroit about where you are an enforcer. So if you're making recommendations, how do you do it in a way that's palatable and consumable? How do you do it in a way or are you going to be perceived as the enforcer? How do you always make sure you're perceived as a collaborator? I think that, again, becomes a skill set that you have to develop and hone as you try to play that role of saying, please don't just keep collecting data that then is not used, and use it meaningfully in ways that promotes all students' success. So with that, I have finished my presentation portion of the conversation, and I think there's some significant time for Q&A. If you want to put in Q&A, again, this is we will, I think at some point, stop sharing screen, Kevin. Am I right, Matt?
Yeah, we're going to do that in just a second.
Okay,
right?
If anyone wants to put in a question here, though, I will be seeing it on the back end. So I'll stop sharing the screen, but if you put it in, then I can see it. You can also put it in the chat. So thank you.
Kevin, feel free to do any wrap up and then I'll stop recording.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that presentation. Some great ideas. I saw a lot of people were engaged in the chat. So we're about to jump into our Q&A and our discussion. So I know a lot of people have questions and thoughts they want to share. So we're going to cut off the recording and now move into that piece of our big chat.
All right.
Thank you,
Kevin. As you guys are here live, stick around. But if you're in YouTube land, we'll see you guys later.